Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our event this afternoon. My name is Dr. Yamile Silva, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of World Languages and Cultures here at the University of Scranton. As part of the Latinx Heritage Month, we are hosting the event Blackness in Latin America and the Caribbean, event that is co-sponsored by the Latin American Studies Program, the Department of World Languages, the Multicultural Center, and the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. We would like to ask you to mute your computer and also to turn off your camera. The event will last 45 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for questions. We are going to ask you to write your questions in the chat, so Dr. Curiel will read them to our guests. Also, please keep in mind that this event will be recorded. And now, let me introduce Dr. Roxana Curiel, who will lead this conversation. Dr. Roxana Curiel joined our institution this semester as an assistant professor of Spanish at the Department of World Languages and Cultures. She is an interdisciplinary scholar. Her research analyzes representations of bodies that challenge normative notions of citizenship, gender, and race in Mexico, Central America, and the Latinx diaspora in the US. Thank you, Roxana, for leading this conversation.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm so excited because I am a big fan of both Mayra and Alán, and I actually never had the chance to engage in any conversation with Mayra, so I'm gonna have a girl fan moment, maybe, so I'm gonna try to keep it cool. So I'm gonna start with Mayra first. Mayra Santos Febres is an Afro-Puerto Rican writer. She holds a PhD from Cornell University and is the recipient of the Juan Rulfo and Puerto Rico's National Literature Awards, and was also a Guggenheim Fellow. Author of some 20 books of poetry, fiction, and literary criticism, her work engages with the diaspora identity, femsexuality, gender fluidity, and race. Some of my personal favorites, which I have used in my courses, are Sirena Selena, which was also a Rómulo Gallegos Award finalist, and Fe en Disfraz. Now, Alán Peláez López is an Afro-Indigenous poet, installation, and adornment artist from the Comunidad Zapoteca of Oaxaca, Mexico. They are the author of Intergalactic Travels, Poems from a Fugitive Alien, finalist for the 2020 International Latino Book Award, and To Love and to Mourn in the Age of Displacement. Both works have been crucial in my courses as well. Alán has been building and creating with undocumented queer and trans migrants for 10 years and is currently on the steering committee of the Black LGBTQIA Migrant Project. And they are also the famous author of the Latinidades Cancel meme, which I'm sorry that we always have to engage with that, but it's a little bit unavoidable. So to start this conversation and considering the topic of the Latinx Heritage Month, and I know that you have probably been asked this question a lot, especially given the current climate in the country and in the world right now. So it seems that the Latinx community in general just discovered that we have Black communities everywhere within them. So this is why I know that you probably are exhausted about having this same conversation about Blackness and Latinidad, and why it seems that there's an antithesis between them that obscures and denies Black life. So having that in mind, I would like to ask you first, how does your work reckons with the erasure created by the mestizaje narrative and the different nationalist agendas? Okay, so Mayra starts first. Oh, Mayra, we cannot hear you.
I have been unmuted. Hi, thank you. This has been a very weird day here in the Caribbean because yesterday it rained and now my house is all discombobulated, and I was working with, since everything has to be done in the house now. So I had electricians here. So if you saw a little bit of a mess, I just picked it up. Now I'm set. Well, the thing with race, I've been thinking a lot about this issue, and I am incredibly glad to meet with Alán Peláez López again. We just had a Zoom a couple of days ago or weeks ago, I don't remember. One of the things that that you have said, Roxana, which is true, is that all of a sudden in the US Latino community and the diaspora, people are starting to talk about the presence of Afro descendants, of people of African descent all over the Latino community. And I always think that that is due to three main facts. Been studying it very, very closely, and sometimes it's difficult to explain, but it's very simple. The first fact is that in the United States, even in the census, the definitions of race and ethnicity and nationality are mixed, are completely intertwined. And there is a tendency to define people's race by their nation of origin. I mean, if you're Mexican, that's supposed to be a race. If you're Puerto Rican, that's supposed to be a race. If you're Cuban, that's supposed to be a race. And and those places are not races. It's just, those are nations. Those are countries that have a completely mixed and very diverse communities. And so there are indigenous communities, there's Chinese, Lebanese, there's people of many ethnicities and Afro descendants too in many countries of Latin America, just as there are in the United States. So that's one of the reasons why all of a sudden the Afro descendant communities in Latin America have disappeared. The second is because of this discourse, this ideology of racial democracy and mestizaje. Supposedly, you know, the nation, the discourse, national discourse says that we have all magically merged into one and only one hybrid mestizo identity that composes the nation. And then what happens with that national discourse is that the diversification becomes unified, and the Creole, white Creole population are the ones that take the word in order to talk for the people. No? So all of a sudden, other words, other voices are obscured. Then there's another, on top of that, there's another another layer of identity that gets put on top of it, which is the identity of the left. You know, all of a sudden, since the 1930s until the 1986 and 87, all those guerrillas and populations have pushed forward a discourse of unification, and that unification is the unification of el pueblo, no? The state or the empire, no? Connected with the Creole aristocracy against the people, and that people have been defined in many ways in a Marxist way, which is the relationship of the workers with their means of production, and that's it. You cannot be gendered, you cannot have an identity, a queer identity, or a non or anti-generic identity, or you cannot have a sexual preference, and you cannot have a race, because those discourses create fractures among the united front that needs to be organized in order to fight and win against the forces of oppression. So those three things connected, the racial democracy and the nationality, the way in which those nationalities get racializados, get turned into races in the US, and the resistance discourses of the people's fight against oppression and colonialism, all of those things combined have erased the voices of difference within Latin America and the US Latino community. So those are the reasons why. On the other hand, and that is just to conclude my answer to your question, there has been a lot of alliances that have also helped and invisibilized race and I just want to point one of them. Very few people know that Arturo Schomburg, you know, the creator of the first archive of African libraries and objects that then turned into the Schomburg Institute, that man was born in Santurce, Puerto Rico. He was an Afro-Puerto Rican. But he joined in the 19th century and early 20th century, he joined the Harlem Renaissance and all sorts of other African-American based communities in order to further his work for race. So for many of us, sometimes the experience is that you have to pick between being Latino or Afro. And as you will see in Alán Peláez and in mine, we can't pick. I mean, at least I can't, you know, this is impossible. I cannot pick. This is who I am, and people are diverse, and you know, the identities that we need to embrace in order to fight for inclusion and justice are very fluid, and we have to create discourses that take into accountability the fluidity and intersectionalities of our identities. Gender, race, nationality, ethnicities, etc., etc. I mean, sexual preferences or whatever, because people are more than their identity.
Thank you so much, Mayra. So now, Alán, can you answer the question as well?
Yeah, I'll add to what Mayra just said. Thank you so much, Mayra, for that really succinct answer. And I'm so happy that you brought up the 1930s to the late 80s, because the guerrilla population, as you identify, is how we went from the shift of race to class, right? Because in Latin America, in certain countries in Latin America, there's this idea of, oh, we don't have racism. What we have is a class issue. And prior to the 30s, there was an understanding of race. And it only took 50 years for that to be diluted through this idea of providing for the nation, doing something for the empire, right? And I think that right now, that's one of the things that's the hardest to address.
Yes.
We have a lot of forced migration from all over the Americas and the Caribbean to the US, to Europe, from South America to Mexico, from Mexico to South America. And we have lost an understanding that migration is not something that we should be doing, right? Right now, we are in a moment of forced migration. We have normalized migration as a Latin American and Caribbean community in the name of empire. I don't want to be in the US. I want to go back to my home country. But what does it mean that my home country is killing people who look like me, right? At the end of 2019, Carmela Parral Santos, an Afro-Indigenous politician and activist, was killed days after opposing a project that the Mexican president, who's supposed to be a liberal president, right, put forth that would pretty much deforestate 13 indigenous communities in the name of tourism, right? It makes me think about Marielle Franco, right, who in March of 2018 is killed. She's killed on March 14th, and on March 13th, the day before she is killed, she tweets against the police and against racism, and the next day, she's found dead, right? All of our migration is forced, and I think that because we focus so much on class, we no longer have a verbiage in which to think through race, through colorism, and because we can't think through race or colorism, we also can't think of the historical formulation that was brought upon through slavery, or the formulations that are being brought up right now through imperialism, right? Because we have a huge population in Latin America of Black migrants from Europe and the continent of Africa, who most of them are undocumented in Central America, a lot of them in Brazil, and the larger chunk in Mexico. And we don't know how to talk about that because we have accepted and normalized migration. And that all dates back to the guerrilla population, the discourse of el pueblo and that sense of unity. And in the US, in the connected 48 states, the notion of latinidad also has decentered migration.
Thank you so much. I actually was not included that part of the guerrilla identity that came, so thank you so much for that. That illuminates the thoughts that have been haunting me for the past years. So you both now address the sense of fluidity of identities and the queerness of it all. So now I would like to address that in the next question, and also in how both of you have engaged in representations of femininity and sexuality that go against the patriarchal hegemony. So I would like to know how you and your work navigate the intersection of being Black, having a femme experience, but also queerness in the context of hypersexualization and disposability of Black femme bodies.
Wow. I think that Alán, I'm just a strange woman. And I have to talk about how this came to be, especially because, you know, that experience led me to writing Sirena Selena Vestida de Pena, but it started way before, and it started when I was a young student at the University of Puerto Rico and engaged in the ACT UP movement. The thing is that I am one of the precarious founders of ACT UP Puerto Rico, because I had a friend, a very, very dear friend that was also a boyfriend of mine before he got out of the closet, although he was never, I don't know if he got out of the closet. He realized that he was gay, and that takes a long time to realize in some situations, and it was because his family was Mita and Aaron, which is like a weird Pentecostal / cult in Puerto Rico from a very, very poor section of San Juan. His name is Moises Augusto Rosario. He's a poet, and he has been an activist, and he works with HIV law and access for the longest time. And I was his girlfriend first, and then I became his partner in all this activism. Actually, I learned how to be a cultural activist through the AIDS epidemic. That's how my femininity or mujerilidad got constructed, and I was very connected to the gay movement in Puerto Rico because of the lack of race movement within my country. This is the weirdest thing, but you have to just take it at face value. There were so few of us at the university level. There were the Concilio Puertorriqueño contra el Racismo, you know, the organization, the oldest organization against racism in Puerto Rico, was all in the hands of very patriarchal, macharranes men. I wasn't gonna go in there. You know, I was a young woman, and that was harsh. And then again, the pro-independentista movement was also in the hands of very, very patriarchal men. And I couldn't go, I didn't feel right in there. So when a big fight erupted, it was the AIDS, it was organized like around, in the 80s, around the AIDS epidemic. And it was very natural for me to go in there. So I learned the performance of gender before Butler published his work. I learned, you know, that that gender is a social construct, that there is a performativity of race and gender, but basically of gender, and that women that were racialized had to face hypersexualization in all fronts, in the left, in the right, in all fronts. And I felt safe among my correligionarios en la lucha against AIDS, because, well, mostly because we like the same kind of men, and also because my lesbian friends were very good bouncers. So I felt safe there, and I felt protected in numbers, and an alliance was something that just enamored me since the beginning. All that political formation was what led to Sirena Selena Vestida de Blanco. You know, I needed to recuperate the voice of all the trans people, of all the houses, Judy Martinez's house, Pantoja's house, all my friends that were dying of AIDS. I couldn't let that voice and that history to get lost. So that's what I did, and I thought of race and gender as a mise en scène, no, as a performance, and also Caribeñidad, what counted as being Caribbean, as this weird experience of being someone else's mirror of desire, you know, and that's what I worked with at the beginning. I started at I always say that I am a transvestite trapped in the body of a Black woman.
Thank you so much, Mayra. It's also really amazing to know the background of that specific novel. So now, Alán, would you like to share your experience on it?
Thank you. Wow, this question of femininity and hypersexualization and race. I think that when I was young, I understood perhaps gender before I understood race. And I think a lot of it has to deal with, I was raised by a woman. My mom is one of 10. She has 7 sisters, right? And I've never lived in a nuclear household. I always lived with my aunts in different places, in different states in Mexico. And I think that being a really young child and seeing gender-based violence happen to all the women in my life, I understood gender really early on. And that's one of the things that prompted my migration. In my book, Intergalactic Travels, I have a poem that is primarily redacted. And it's a poem about me being essentially stoned in Mexico City by the person who was taking care of me, who was not a family member. And me at a young age being stoned because of my femininity, being the marker of who I am, is interrupting who I am supposed to be. Right? I was being punished for, in a sense, disassociating with masculinity. I was being punished for not being a desirable Mexican man, whatever that may mean, when I was a young child. And then I think that growing up in the US and growing up in a community of primarily migrants where everybody around me, all my friends, they only had their mothers, right? It was like all of them were single mothers who had migrated to the US. That gave me an understanding of what it means to be the target of the state outside of the realm of race. Because I don't think I understood race as a young migrant at the level that I understood gender, right? And I think it's because for me, what was always obvious was femicides. That was always on the back of my mind. I think that for those of us who have grown up in really poor communities, we all have stories of who has died, who has been killed. And there's no coincidence that most of them are women, and a lot of them are young women who fight back. And also the ones who are assumed to be masculine or men, a lot of them are very feminine. And it's interesting because in Oaxaca, one of the few memories that I have before my migration was La Guelaguetza. And we have El Baile del Diablo. And El Baile del Diablo is people who are assumed to be men dancing in skirts with no top. And all the people who are assumed to be women drumming in a circle. And everybody's wearing a mask of a devil. And this is an African diasporic dance. It is a dance that some historians have traced back to Angola, right? And it's like, it's people who we assume to be men betraying gender, a completely different orientation to gender than how we understand it today. And for me, it's like, when I began to learn more about the Guelaguetza and particularly that dance, I was like, oh wow, like this dance is like racialized, it is gendered, and it is a continental Blackness that is punished. And even right now, right, I think that one of the things that the feminist movement in Latin America is trying to do is trying to really think through hypersexualization and the eroticization of gender. But I think that one of the things that the feminist movement sometimes misses is the ways in which race is also eroticized and fetishized. And sometimes race is missing in the discourse, particularly in countries that are predominantly non-Black. Because I know that that discourse is super prevalent in Colombia. I see it a lot from the Afro-Peruvian community. Like when I think about Blackness and gender in Latin America, I immediately go to Puerto Rico, Colombia, Peru, Brazil. Like those are always the first ones that I'm like, okay, that's what I need to look at. And you know, also the DR and Haiti. But yeah, I'll stop at that.
No, thank you so much. That was, I'm sorry, Mayra, I don't know if you wanted to say something else about it. I just think it's really interesting what's going on right now in Latin America with all the feminist movements right now, in spite of being quarantined, like that everybody's still on the streets fighting, and they're fighting back the states, like each nation state, because they realize that the government really doesn't care about us. So it's not us defending, creating communities of care. The government, it's really never gonna care about us. Yeah, it's a little bit tied to that question, because in our current climate right now, and we're thinking about what's going on right now in the US with the Black Lives Matters protests, and also how has existed this alliances between the Latinx communities as well, but denying that there's Black communities within the Latinx community, trying to engage in allyship. I'm sorry if I'm losing you here. It's just like, it's a bit of a complicated question that I have in mind. So right now in the US, whenever we talk about reparations, now this is this discourse of abolition, that it seems like it's our only way to create different conditions. So I would like to know from you, what do you think about abolition as a transnational project, considering all the movements and all the protests that are going on right now in different places in Latin America, and if they have a chance in intersecting and actually acknowledging the racialization that it's needed. So how can abolition can exist as a transnational project, do you think?
Well, I think that, let me start with the beginning. I think that race, and I am stealing this concept from Alán. Actually, I've been quoting you like crazy. Race is a geo-specific experience. You know, although racism is global, the experience of that racism is geo-specific. And I think that that is the clearest and most amazing and intelligent way of understanding this, because one cannot think bipolarly, black, white. That is what got us into this mess. You know, if you put US and Latin America, then Blackness gets completely erased. If you think polarly, you know, in dichotomies, you cannot understand what we're trying, all of us are trying to convey. And so one of the things that I think is really important for us to imagine is the reticular set of alliances and common ground that has to be configured to create fights about race. You know, the thing is that the Black Lives Matter, it touched a very important fiber in the lives of all of us all over the place, because Black lives don't matter in many places. In many places in Europe, in many places of Latin America, in many places, you know, it wasn't until 1986 that in Costa Rica, if one of your parents was Jamaican, that's so Black, which happens a lot in Latin America, there's a lot of migrations within Latin America. Cubans that come to Puerto Rico, Dominicans that come to Puerto Rico, and then to US, Jamaicans that go to Panama, Mexicans that go, Guatemalans that go to Mexico. You know, it is not a block. Not all of US Latino migration, all of Latin American migration is to Europe or the US. It's not like that. There's a lot of internal migration within Latin America. And in all these things, all these variables, all these variables are used against Blackness, for instance, or against Afro-Indigenous communities. And you're denied nationality. In Puerto Rico, sometimes I'm walking down the street and people talk to me in English because there are no Blacks in Puerto Rico. Still now, and they tell me, hi, may I help you? Yo, sí, mi hijo. Empezando por hablarme en español, you know? So that is one of the reasons why we have to unite and we have to find a common ground. Genocide is a project. It's you know, genocide is all over the place, and that's why the Black Lives Matter movement had such resonance in many places in the world. But there is what I call a forced separationist and apartheid that is an experience in the States, and a forced integrationist that is an experience in Latin America. You know, you're denied your Blackness, but you're Puerto Rican. And don't talk a lot about your Blackness, because if not, your Puerto Ricanness might be questioned. You know, so it's a forced integrationist racism. That sounds really weird, but it is. And I think that reparations have to be fought globally. But first we have, and for this I always think about Bruce Stevenson and the ways in which he says in his Just Mercy book and in his project for justice and peace in Montgomery, Alabama, he said that before that we have to have a very serious talk about how racism, slavery has not ended in many places. And one of the places that it hasn't ended, or the ways in which it hasn't ended, is by the criminalization of Black bodies, and then the forced exploitation of labor. You know, that is modern racism, slavery. So this abolitionist movement and the ways in which law sustains and perpetuates in the States, for instance, and in many places in Latin America, slavery, we're talking about slavery. We have to address that, because I don't think that slavery is over. Yeah. And that, you know, breaks my heart. It is disguised under the discourse of law and crime. I mean, how can you possibly, how can a woman that steals a jacket gets 127 years of condena, you know, in jail, you know? How do you have 14-year-old kids, migrant or Latinos or Afro-Latinos or African-American 14-year-olds being condemned to death row? You know, what is that? And so we have to talk about that, to talk about, you know, the continuation of slavery, and also then the reparations that we have to be made.
Thank you so much, Mayra. So Alán, can you share your thoughts on this abolition as a transnational project?
Absolutely, thank you. I think that being situated in the Americas, right? The Americas are this is a new empire. It's not old. It's not super structured, right? And I think that when we talk about abolition, we need to be honest, and abolition requires the undoing of the state, the undoing of the nation. Because abolition, it's not just abolish prisons, right? You need to abolish the system that makes the assumed threat a threat, which is citizenship, right? I think that the core of all of this is citizenship. We do not, the opposite, I say this quite often, the opposite of the citizen is not the non-citizen. The opposite of the citizen is the threat to empire, right? And that's why indigenous people and those who are assumed to be Black people are the ones that are targeted, and as well as women, right? Because they are speaking back to patriarchy, and the nation and patriarchy go hand in hand. You can never separate nationhood, like la patria can never be separated from el patriarcal. Like it is the same word, it comes from the same root. And we really need to undo how we understand citizenship, and we need to undo the desire that we have for protection. If you continue to desire for protection from a nation state, you are continuing to desire the elimination of indigenous peoples and Black people. And that is exactly what citizenship is. And that's why the afterlife of slavery is not over, because the end goal of slavery was maximize the plantation state for the countries that plantations was a thing, right? In certain Latin American countries, they were not plantation-based slavery, it was military-based slavery. Black people were forced to extend empire through militia. They weren't in plantations. And the goal was like, yes, these are disposable people and we can produce more through what Christina Sharp calls a monstrous intimacy, right? Through rape. And abolition requires a disassociation of citizenship, which means it requires a departing from the law. We actually have to get rid of extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is what gave colonizers the right of way to colonize the Americas. They were using the legal-based system from the country that they were representing and saying, we are enacting these laws here, and through extraterritorial jurisdiction, this is now our land. And I think that when we think about abolition, we usually just go to like the modern day plantation, or the last plantation, which was like, we can see it in the US, right? It's really hard to think of abolition in places like, let's say, Guatemala, which was one of the first countries, which I think was the first country in the connected Americas to abolish slavery. Guatemala is such a tiny country, and because they abolished it 100 years before the US, there's less of a discourse on plantation-based slavery in Guatemala than there is a discourse on so few of us are claiming Blackness, and because none of us are claiming it, we actually can't fight for certain types of sovereignty and certain types of protection. In Guatemala, the fight for Black lives looks very different, because it's a fight against mestizaje and a fight against, we have been indoctrinated into a notion of being Guatemalans that we now can't fight for protection based on race, because we got indoctrinated into the nation state. And I think that we don't know how to have conversations on the different ways in which we experience Blackness across the continent and how all of it is legally bound. We are not Black, we were assigned Blackness through slavery. It's a legal assignment. It's not a racial category that is stable. So why can't we like disidentify from the legal system? And I think that I only understand this because I was undocumented for almost 20 years. The root of my undocumentedness wasn't that I didn't have papers. It was the fact that I was still Black and still indigenous in an empire. That was what, like, that was the thing that felt suffocating and still feels suffocating. I have papers now, but I still feel the same way as when I was undocumented.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so powerful. And I think having this conversation about abolition in general, it's really necessary. And I think that one of the elements of abolition that I like the most right now, it's the thing about imagination, imagining different conditions and not letting the empire convince us that there's no other way. So I would like to know right now, like, how does your work helps you to imagine different conditions, or how does your work allows you to heal, and it's part of your imagination process?
The work that I just finished, I just finished yesterday a book. This novel that was driving me crazy called La Otra Julia. And La Otra Julia is about Julia de Burgos. It's an auto-fictional book. It's not an autobiographical, it's auto-fiction. I create fiction with my own experiences, but bouncing them 100 years ago with the life of Julia de Burgos, which is another Puerto Rican, Afro-Puerto Rican woman that died at 39 years old in 160 in Harlem. No? And I bounced those two historical narratives back and forth. And in order to heal, and in order also to imagine a new future, other conditions, I had to think about specifically about history. I really think that the Sankofa principle, looking back in order to look at the future, is important, because there's so many of us, so many of our histories that have been silenced, and therefore we have only one view that says this is the future and this is the way, and one way goes that way. But we have all sorts of histories and narratives that tell us of different ways, of different routes towards the manifestation of our energies as human beings, other human beings. I think that that is really important. So I really like historical fiction. Right? I like the revision of history and the recuperation of memory, and the Wakanda Afrofuturist project. You know, how do you look back in order to project a different way of thinking about what can be? And I always like to look sideways also. I've learned a lot from Alán and this idea of being undocumented, because I come from exactly the different, you know, the opposite history, which is that we were colonized, you know, 1898, we were botín de guerra, we were passed from the Spaniards to the United States, and citizenship was imposed on us. I have no possibility to claim any other citizenship than it is the U.S. citizenship. I don't know if I want it that much. I mean, it's okay. I would have a lot of them. I think that is one, but I also want a Cuban one and a Mexican one. I want, you know, like the COVID masks, I want one citizenship for every pair of shoes. But I mean, the thing is that it can be as playful as that, because, but it is very difficult to imagine how listening to Alán and listening to other Afro Latin Americans, it's really important, that transversal dialogue, in order to imagine different future, and that really gives. I can imagine different ways, because other people are so generous that they lend me their eyes, they lend me their experience in order for me to complete mine. And I think literature does that. Literature and art gives you perspective, give you other places in order to stand and look at the world. And so I always talk, and I always want, when I write in a system. I write from Puerto Rico, but for instance, in La Otra Julia, I'm always talking about the time that Julia lived in Cuba, that Julia lived in the US, that I lived in Mexico, that we lived in, you know, the ways in which we travel that can configure an identity that is more fluid and that is more fractal, that is not unified, but that is reticular. You know? So that is the way in which I use art in terms of novel, and in terms of poetry. You know, we should never forget that poetry comes from an internal conversation with what is divine you. And I'm using the word divine, you know, divino, not God, divine, sacred, you know. And so it is the song, it is conjuring, it is also maldecir. Poetry comes from that internal, not emotional front, but also from that internal vínculo, that connection with what is more than you know, your ancestors, your hopes, your dreams, your heridas, you know, the wounds, and that is what it is. It is not form. I hate when I give classes, creative writing classes, and they ask me, but how do I write a sonnet? And I said, why do you want to write a sonnet? Or iambic pentameter. No, you have to breathe the rhythm. It is the breathing of your heart. And that is why poetry is so important for all of us in recuperating that voice. You know, the presence of a voice that has a texture and a rhythm that is particular to our specific experience of race, gender, migration, etc. So that is really important. That's in poetry and in narrative. I do both. And then essays, I am enamored. I am in love with things. And I think it is a resistance, you know, action.
Thank you so much, Mayra. Alán, can you share with us the healing and the imagination?
Thank you so much. I really appreciated hearing you, Mayra, talking about just the way you have to breathe the rhythm and your auto-fictional novel. I've been working on a play for, I want to say, almost 3 years, and it's a play about toddlers in Oaxaca who shapeshift into dragonflies in order to avoid sequestration and death, and then make their way across the Americas. And eventually, one child realizes that they can shapeshift and goes back to Oaxaca to teach the rest of the community how to shapeshift. In order for them to be able to come and go as they please outside of the bounds of borders and nations. And like this story, I feel like this story was told to me growing up, right? My mom has very fond memories of always playing with dragonflies and having a particular relationship to that insect. My grandmother constantly also tells me about, for a good portion of our time, like our main groups of food were insects, right? So grasshoppers, chicatanas, dragonflies. And my grandmother also tells me stories about shapeshifting, about how we once had the ability to shapeshift. And for me, none of this is myth. I think that the literary world will read something like this and be like, oh, you went to mythology, or you went to fiction. And I'm like, this is not mythology, this is not fiction. These are experiences, these are realities that settler colonialism tries to repress. And for me, it's about excavating for the stories that I was told when I was younger and trying to retell them. I feel that my work is not isolated. All of my work is a retelling of the stories that were told to me growing up. And for me, when I think about the ways in which people are being targeted right now by the carceral system, for me, it's like they're being targeted for their surplus of imagination. People who are targets of the state are willing to do whatever it takes to live a livable life, and that makes them a target. And I think that the writer, the artist is also targeted. Their imagination is attacked. We are taken, like Black artists are taken for granted because the worlds that we have imagining interrupt everything that we've accepted and expect. We have so much to offer, but because it's so radically different than what we live in right now, we're just not prioritized, and it sucks.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you so much. It is kind of like, my question was like, how can you imagine different conditions? It's like we already have different conditions, but the empire just doesn't agree with them and have been murdering everyone that just doesn't agree with the current system. Okay, so yeah, Yamile, do we have questions from the chat?
No, but probably now we can open that, and as I mentioned at the beginning, if you had any question, please write it into the chat, and then we pass them to Mayra and Alán.
Yeah, because we have like 5 more minutes, so if in
Mayra.
Mayra.
I have a list of conditions that Black and all of us need, and one of them is to be able to live from our work. You know, that would be wonderful. That's mostly what we're asking, you know, to live from our work. I have like 4 jobs, and I'm fine. I'm not saying, you know, I know what not having is like, and now I do have. I have a place for my kids, and I can send them to school. But it took me like 40 years, but I did it. And still, I have to be writing proposals and doing this and doing that and doing each workshop here and there, and that is difficult. And I also think that we need a different circuit for the circulation of our work. It would be wonderful if all these associations, these Afro-feministas and Latinoamericas and Afro-Latinos and all this weird, I mean, I have been researching the amount of organizations that they're all over Latin America and the US, and the allies of these organizations. We're huge. Why don't we create a different circuit? Why does it have to be by Amazon or the Nobel Prize or whatever, you know? Because that organization is just to perpetuate what we have. So those 2 imaginations, at least, I don't know about the world, but about the literary and academic world, are really important, because as I said in my previous Zoom, which was like 3 or 4 days ago, it is important. This is the moment. I've never seen so many Afro-Indigenous women, immigrants, sons of immigrants with PhDs ever in my life. There is a vast set of alliances. We just have to, you know, find a common ground and organize in a particular non-hierarchical way in order to create sustenance and support for the work that we're doing.
Thank you so much, Mayra. I have a couple of questions that I think I'm gonna merge into one, because like we don't have that much time, but it's about the language. So I'm gonna try to read into these both questions that kind of have the same question in mind. So it's like, what role does language play in the issues raised today and within your work? English is becoming an international language and therefore creating a new empire in itself. So how do you navigate these languages that form your personality and identity in this context?
Alán?
Oh, wow. I write in English primarily. Sometimes I write in Spanish. What I tried to do is, a few years ago, one of my friends and advisors and mentors, Beth Piatod, who's Nespers, really pushed me. And she was like, you need to learn Zapotec. And I was like, no, that's too much trauma, too difficult. But I've been trying to learn Zapotec slowly. And I sent in a poem in Zapotec to an indigenous journal a few years ago, and they accepted it. And I was like, I know that it's in bad Zapotec, that it's not grammatically correct. And their response was like, that's not the point. The point is that you're insisting the language to live around you, despite if it's grammatically incorrect. And for me, I'd rather engage in a messy, like really sit with messiness and fragmentation. And if you ever, I think that if you ever encounter my work, just like digital work, just how I tweet or on Instagram, I always write in fragments. I'm not invested in writing like these really, in like really rigorous language, whatever that might be. And I mean, I think that the question is like very concerned with English. And for me, I'm like, okay, but I think I'm more concerned with the way in which Spanish also has created an empire and the way in which Spanish is used to discipline. Because I feel like when I do write in Spanish, I try to just write in the way that my mom and my grandmother speak. Because growing up, I was always disciplined on my Spanish because it's like a hybrid language. Like the title of the play is Chambale, which in my village means dragonfly. It's not libélula, right? And every time I present Chambale to somebody, they're like, what does that mean? And I'm like, it means dragonfly. And they're like, oh no, you have the wrong word. And I'm like, I do not. This is what my community knows it as. I think that sometimes we're so fast to critique English that we forget that Spanish is also a disciplining language that is further indoctrinating gender and nationalism.
I write in many languages. I write in Spanish and English, and I mix them both. And in the Caribbean, there's a long since the 70s, and there's the Rican poets movement, and so on. There has been a lot of Spanglish roaming around our literary scene. So I think that the question is the point is the insisting on purifying languages and language practices and trying to break them. You know, I write in the most Caribbean oral tradition that I can find, and that is mixed. That is a mix between Spanish and English long before the U.S. is here, because we also have a very strong U.S. Virgin Island migration to the island, to Puerto Rico, and there's people whose names are, I don't know, Isabel Lubersa Oppenheimer or Daniel Lind, and all those people come from either from Jamaica or from the U.S. Virgin Islands or from Santo Tomas, San Cruz, and Croix, all over the place. And my name, Mayra Santos Febres, is a creolization of Lefebvre. I come from Haiti and also from Louisiana. So we have to start thinking about these movements of people and the history that is embodied in us, in our tongues too, and the way in which everything is. And the question of language has been addressed in a joyful and playful, but also in a very fragmented, like Alán said, and unpurified way.
I really wanna ask this question, and maybe you can have a short answer, but I think that it's important to address this one. So I'm gonna read it from one of our spectators. I'm always a young Afro-Puerto Rican woman, and all my life I struggle with society trying to shove me into one categorical box and pick which part of my identity I want to identify with. My question will be, what is your advice to young people who are struggling with society, forcing selective identity onto them when they want to accept all of who they are?
It's a long fight. It's a long, long fight, honey. You just have to, stand your ground. And I think that young people, the more that people know that they don't have to choose, helps. Right now I'm trying to create 10 video tutorials about Afro-Latinos and race in English, in Spanish, and in Portuguese. And hopefully we can translate it into other languages that are indigenous languages of Latin America, Garifuna, Pidgin, Tzotzil, Zoque, whatever, in order to create a dialogue of our diversity. I think that as a young Afro-Puerto Rican woman, you have asked the correct question, and as an old Afro-Puerto Rican woman, or mature, I say, all I can tell you is, honey, that young people need to know both that the Afro, this is richness. The fact that you are hybrid or tetra hybrid or whatever means that you have inherited many different cultural strands that are within you, as in your DNA, and one has to what one has to do is to embrace that multiplicity at the beginning and say, this is not a problem, this is your problem, this is not my problem, I'm richer because I have many, problem with purity is that it's only one. And the multiplicity means that you have access to and claim different heritages.
Thank you. So Alán, can you give us your advice to our viewers?
I mean, I think Mayra I don't have much to add from Mayra. I think that as long as you know what one of the things that I used to struggle with is that people would dismiss my experience. And it's like, no, you have to acknowledge your experience and know that that's your experience, despite what people tell you you're experiencing. If you can trust your intuition, like you're set. Listen to your intuition, don't listen to other people.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jamila. Do we have time for another question, or we have to like we
Had any other questions? I don't know if someone wants to ask the last question.
I have another question that I think that Alán came, because this is for Alán. But it says like, well, they want to thank them for what they were sharing, and this is the question has to do with the idea of the racial democracy and the idea of hybrid mestizo, and what is the best way to show apoyo to the community without speaking over it. So how can mestizos reconciliate and connect their indigenous roots in a respectful way? So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I get this question often. I think that it's not necessarily of how can we like uplift or speak. I think it's of how are you going to make sure you learn to respect Indigenous peoples? And I think part of it starts with, you have to get rid of the fantasy of indigeneity. Being Indigenous is not like this romantic fun thing. And I think people assume that it's like the best way to live life. And I'm like, okay, yeah, Indigenous people can also be bad people to each other. Like, I don't understand why people romanticize it so much. And I think if somebody is mestizo and like they grew up in the Americas, one very easy thing to do is just to get to know, well, who are the people that historically stewarded that land. All you need to know is who was there and learn as much as you can from them. It's not about you reconnecting with them, because you might not even be from that community. Your parents may have, like your ancestors may have been migrants from somewhere else in the Americas. I think it's about learning how to respect people and name them, acknowledge them, and then kind of like figure out what are the people they're asking for and how can I help them ask for the same thing, right? I think as somebody who right now, I live in Chochenyo Ohlone territory, and the Ohlone people are not federally recognized as Indigenous peoples in the US. They have no federal recognition. And for me, I'm not like trying to like exert my Zapotec identity here. I'm like, these are the demands from the Ohlone people, particularly in Oakland, where I live. How can I show up for them? How can I go to their protests, right? That's being in relationship too. It's not like insisting something onto them of like, you need to accept me because I'm this. It's like, it doesn't matter what I am. What matters is your goals and your needs. And I'm there.
Thank you so much. I think allyship and doing what you can to help, using the whatever privilege, because we all have privileges according to our positionality. It's just using it in a way that it actually creates communities of care across all of these different identities. So I think we don't have more questions, right, Jamile? Okay, so thank you so much for everyone that stayed with us throughout this whole conversation. I think it was so powerful, and it's I have learned so much. I always learn so much from your work, and now listening to you in conversation. So thank you so much to Alán and Mayra for sharing your experiences and to let us have a pick on your imagination in your world. So, Jamila, do you want to say anything?
No, I just want to say thank you for accepting this invitation. It has been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to hear you. And thank you for everybody for joining us tonight. Okay. Mayra.
Gracias y gracias por llamarme.
Sí, gracias.